Hey there. As dusk softens the far edge of the Texas plains and the last rays swirl bronze over rugged stone, a restless wind stirs through the wilds, whispering names long lost. Tonight, let's step inside a true-life riddle, the legend of Spider Rock, and a fortune in Spanish gold said to slumber beneath the dust. Behind every faded map and cryptic mark is a story of danger, hope, and the perilous cost of obsession. And before we reach the end of this journey, you'll hear about a set of ancient stones with secrets carved deep, something found by firelight that changed everything. If atmospheric mysteries and cinematic bedtime journeys carry you away, then you're in the right place. Dim your lights, settle where you're warm, and get comfortable, because the old West Texas wind is about to tell us what it remembers. When Dave Arnold first stepped down from the rattling stage into the arid hush of West Texas, what hit him was not just the heat, but the scent, the dust-baked earth, wild mesquite, and even, faintly, silver, a gleaming promise beneath all that desolation. It was 1902, a time when Texas stretched unbroken, its horizons long and almost lawless. Smoke curled from distant ranch shacks, and the grasslands seemed endless except for where ancient rocks broke from the surface, his faces marked by time and something older still. At dusk, porch conversations bent toward things not yet tamed, a fortune that walked the line between dream and danger. He made his way to a weathered town whose lone main street ran like a scar through the prairie. Tin roofs hammered in the desert sun. Horses snorted behind split-rail fences. Under the low-hanging shade of a cottonwood, locals gathered in the slanting heat, swapping stories with voices pitched low, as if the mesquite thickets himself might be listening. This country was stitched together by tales, ancestors who vanished in search of gold, carved clues on sun. Bleached rocks, Spanish ghosts, it was said, glimpsed at the edge of campfire shadows. Dave kept his purpose hidden at first. He'd come for the Spanish gold treasure, one of the most enduring legends ever carried on the Texas wind. It was not his first brush with fables, but these stories bore marks of something real. He carried dates, landmarks, and, most curious of all, a name: Spider Rock. In every tale, Spider Rock loomed at the heart of the puzzle, an isolated pillar of sandstone rising from the plain, its weathered flanks lined with faint, unnatural grooves. According to hushed recollection, beneath or near that crag, where the river valley curved and the world seemed emptied of all but memory, the Spanish had buried a fortune centuries before. As the sun crept lower, dust floated sideways in the wind, and Dave's boots lifted old footprints along a barely visible cattle trail. He traced maps held together with yellowed tape and borrowed clues from wrinkled sheepskin, the ink fading to ghostlight and carrying patterns no one could quite decipher. At camp, his fingers brushed over the map, the lines soft beneath his touch, concentric circles, strange runes, and an old upright letter, H set apart from the rest. The marks were as cryptic as the shifting layers of twilight. Men had tried to unravel him for years, each believing that just one more night, just one more guess, would reveal the truth. Somewhere out there, Dave knew, more than rumor was waiting. Late in his first week, he heard about a wandering sheep herder who spoke little English, but whose eyes burned with the intensity of one who has stumbled upon a secret. In a battered, moth-eaten coat, The herder beckoned Dave to a low rise where the ground, undisturbed, wore a single strange mark, an indentation shaped like nested rings at the crest of a stray stone, and on another face the carved H. At that moment the wind curled harder, lifting sand against Dave's eyes, a warning, or perhaps a welcome, before falling away to sharp stillness. The herder was careful, almost reverent, as if his own safety depended on keeping quiet. He glanced at the hill just beyond the stone and pressed his finger firmly into the dust. Here, he implied, was a place of consequence, where treasure and fate might intersect. Nights on the plain were sharp-edged, the chill stealing through every seam. But Dave welcomed the discomfort. Sleep eluded him, his mind flickering with possible meanings for the circles and the H. Was it a Spanish code, a boundary, or a warning? No one he spoke with, neither rancher nor weathered old-timer, could offer an answer. His suspicion only deepened the mystery. Why so many marks? Why this particular hill? And how had the legend persisted for so long in a place where everything else seemed swept away by time? Wind cut through camp, carrying the wild perfume of dried grass and sun-warmed rock. The days began to settle into rhythm, rising before dawn, greeting sunrise with a mug of bitter coffee, warmed over cedar coals, then scanning the landscape for signs missed before. He ran his calloused hands across stone after stone, waiting for some vibration or glimmer of metal beneath his fingertips. Every unearthed fragment felt freshly mysterious. Each glint of quartz or iron promised, for an instant, that it might be gold instead. 3 weeks in, a sudden thunderstorm rolled over the plains, its blue-black belly low and growling. Lightning etched Spider Rock's silhouette in stark relief, casting wild shadows that danced and shivered alongside Dave's tent. He lay awake as the storm raged, thinking back to every piece of the puzzle so far, marks in stone, stories thick with yearning, and always the weight of that hidden fortune. The land here did not hand over its secrets easily. It demanded patience and, more dangerously, a willingness to risk everything. What if the truth was an invention, just dust and hope? What if, somewhere beneath the wind-carved rock, real gold waited? Or worse, something never meant to be found? As dawn broke with new, golden clarity, Dave returned to the marked hill with a spade and a fistful of second guesses. The ground was as stubborn as rumor, flinty and sun-baked on the surface, loose as memory below. For hours his shoulders knotted with effort. The scent of rain lingered, earth and broken mesquite crumbling under his hands. Every few inches another stone turned up, some painted yellow from years in the sun, one bearing an impression he couldn't place, a pattern too deliberate to be chance. Each discovery brought as many doubts as answers. The more Dave dug, the more the story seemed to change shape. He thought of the sheep herder, vanished as abruptly as he'd appeared, and wondered what truths the man still carried. The legend's outlines grew ever murkier, tangled with old Spanish fables, Wild West paranoia, and the endless appetite for hope that drew men into ruin beneath an unforgiving sun. Somewhere in the growing pile of unearthed rock, Dave found a heavier piece streaked with red clay. When he turned it, the circles were unmistakable now. 4, set perfectly inside each other. The pigment faded and ancient. The surface was cool in his palm, and, for a moment, his heart hammered in the quiet dawn. This was no accident. This was a sign. But a sign of what, he couldn't say. Not yet. Back at camp, he crouched beside a trembling lantern, memorizing every mark, every faint groove etched by hands lost to time. Somewhere between dawn and sleep, his obsession grew roots. The promise of gold twisted into something sharper, a need to know, a hunger for truth that might never be sated. He could feel the stakes changing. It was no longer about gold, but about what the legend meant to the land, to the people, and to him. Yet, with every answer wrestled from the soil, a dozen more questions crawled out of the earth. Dave ran his fingers one last time over the circles and the H, wondering if what he'd found was a gateway to actual fortune, or just another riddle staring back, silent and unbroken, in the chill dawn. Out in the distance, as wind rose against Spider Rock, the map waited in his tent, its faded ink brightening in the early sun. Tomorrow he would try again. The sheepskin map felt alive in his hands, its cracked parchment surface bearing faded ink and baffling symbols. Dave Arnold sat cross-legged near the low flicker of a mesquite fire, his palms pressed to the frayed edges of the map. The yellowed, brittle surface seemed to pulse whenever he ran his thumb over a dark, looping symbol. The night pressed close on the West Texas River Valley, heavy with the scent of charcoal and distant wild sage. His team spoke in uneasy murmurs just beyond the fire's reach, every word shaped by a mixture of hope and mounting fear. The horizon was rimmed with the last ash-grey hues of day, making the folds and ridges of the land around him look endless and unknowable. Something in the old map felt animate, as if the stories pressed into its surface had never really faded. Every faded landmark, a hooked curve that might have been a river, a dot-ringed spiral like a spider's lair, a cluster of jagged lines that teased the shape of mesas, looked less like directions and more like riddles painted in code. Dave's calloused fingertips lingered on each line, and for a brief moment he felt the weight of all those lost centuries crowding in, the hush of Spanish coins, boots churning up dust, the prickling sense that somewhere in these plains secrets were waiting to wake. Jake Mathewson, the youngest of the group, watched from the shadows, his knees drawn to his chest. "Those marks," he muttered, half to himself and half to Dave. "Do you really think they're Spanish? They don't look like anything I've seen in the archives." Dave shook his head, frustration sharpening his breath. Whoever made this wanted it unreadable to just anyone. Could be an old explorer's joke, or a warning. The men fell silent as wind surged down from the ridges, brushing dust against weathered boots and scraping his faces with the raw edge of the wilds. The fire danced, throwing spidery shadows over the hunched team. The river's slow chuckle was the only rhythm in the darkness. Earlier that evening, Dave had tried tracing one of the landmarks, an abstract multi-part star with forked legs. It appeared again and again along roots on the sheepskin's surface, tangled up with odd marks that looked almost like tally strokes or the shape of old knives. Each mark seemed to respond differently beneath his fingertips, some deep and confident, others little more than a faded scratch. He gazed into the flames, and the faces of men passed down through Spanish legend flickered there. Stories of buried caravans and vanished outposts, fortunes lost beneath centuries of sand and forgetfulness. Texas was filled with old tales, monks and mercenaries hoarding gold in secret caves, coded maps hidden inside church walls, bones left behind as proof or warning. But tonight, the only proof was the tingling press of age-old ink and the chilling sense of being trespassers in a land that preferred its ghosts left sleeping. Wind swept through again, swirling ash along the hard-packed ground. The acrid scent of scorched earth and sweat filled every breath. Dave studied the team, each man half illuminated by the orange drift of the fire. Jake with his restless hands, old Tom polishing his battered lantern, and Eddie quietly sharpening a shovel. Dave's map was the fulcrum, all eyes drawn back to it between each lull in conversation, every man hungry for a clue to the Spanish gold or the mystery of Spider Rock. Jake cleared his throat. Without looking at the others, he said, "What if none of it's real? All those stories, all those marks, maybe we're just fooling ourselves." His voice held a plea, almost fragile in the darkness. But it was old Tom who cut through, his tone low and warm. "There's things buried out here, son. Maybe gold, maybe bones. Least we can do is try to read what's been left. Everything else is just wind." The others let the words settle. In the silence, a coyote called far off, its thin song unspooling across the plains, looping back memories of old searchers swallowed by the silence. Shadows shifted, the river churning over stones, the night alive with uncertainty. Dave thumbed lightly along a ragged tier at the map's edge, a crescent-shaped slice that caught the fire's gleam. The texture was strange there, a faint raised mark almost like a rune. He wondered how many hands before his had memorized this artifact, hunting for patterns or warnings. Feeling a sudden burst of conviction, he pulled the map taut and stared at the symbols, trying to decipher his logic. The sun-baked scent of old leather and wax drifted up from the parchment, mixing with the tang of dust caught up by the night wind. He had come this far because of a sheep herder's tale, passed around campfires and trading posts until it reached Dave's ear. The herder, rough-hewn and weathered, had spoken of the map's secret. Use the sheepkin, he'd claimed, and it would lead not to treasure directly, but to another map, this one carved in stone. The promise hung between every member of Dave's team, a second layer of secrecy, more daunting than the first. A sudden shout snapped his attention. Eddie, standing near a pile of flat river rocks, was waving his arms, his lamp throwing swinging cones of light. The men scrambled to his feet, boots crunching through parched grass and pushing up small clouds of silt. He gathered as Eddie pointed wordlessly to the base of a large, flat boulder. The wind shifted, revealing an unbearable stench, ripe with rot, and earth chilled by shadow. Beneath the boulder, the faint outlines of human remains poked through the soil. A pair of boots, a cracked belt buckle, the dull glint of tarnished metal half consumed by the ground. The men reeled back, nostrils flaring, some covering his faces with sleeves. A hush swept over him, broken only by the soft, shuddering rasp of Jake's breath. The team had heard the herder's warning. The land would give up bones as easily as gold, and every marker was a crossroads of greed and regret. Dave squatted, his fingers hovering just above the exposed dirt, unwilling to touch the bones, a line crossed that might never be uncrossed. Instead, he focused on the glint of metal buried near the cadaver's palm. Carefully, he brushed away the earth, his calloused hands growing slick with sweat. The object caught the lamplight, a Spanish coin, worn smooth at the edges, its script nearly vanished, but unmistakable in its weight. Hope and dread battled in Dave's chest. Each discovery only deepened the puzzle. Was the sheepkin map an elaborate snare, bait for the desperate? Or did every grisly find confirm that something, gold or darker secrets, truly lay beneath Spider Rock's shadow? He looked back once more at the cryptic lines, tracing the spider-shaped sigils that crawled up the map's surface. Other stones around his camp bore similar pictorial codes, haunting the men with his dense, undeciphered meanings. No one could say for sure where these symbols came from, or what he spelled out, but the valley was rich with echoes, each mark beneath his fingertips grounding him in a history that was mostly silence and only fragments of speech. Far in the distance, the dry wind carried a soft, almost musical clang from a cattle bell, a sound both familiar and surreal. It grounded the team, reminding him for a fleeting second of the ordinary world still turning beyond the valley. But within the ring of firelight, the rules of that world slipped away. The treasure hunters stared at the ancient map, at unearthed bones, at old coins that seemed to burn with an uncanny promise. With every smoky gust of wind, with every cryptic line Dave tried to unlock, the mystery redoubled. Was this the threshold of fortune, or was it the start of obsession? Each man found himself holding his breath, daydreaming gold, while the shadow of Spider Rock pressed in, asking its own silent questions. From the haze rose the sheep herder, his answers wrapped in riddles and legend. In the glow of the canvas lamp, the sheep herder shuffled into the night slit between Dave Arnold's weather-stained tent and the world outside. Charcoal lines of dusk stitched over his face, his boots already sinking marks in the powdery earth. Each evening, just as the land cooled and the chorus of cicadas softened, he would settle by Dave's camp, stories flickering in his throat like moths to flame. This was how legends first walked into Dave's waking life, through that slow, deliberate cadence. The herder reserved for secrets shared only by those who'd spent a lifetime measuring horizon lines and counting the ways the wind could change its mind. The herder's tales circled back often to the Mexican priests. He spoke of men in frayed habits, crossing these baked plains centuries before, slipping through river grass with the certainty of those guarding more than just his souls. Sometimes, as the fire spat red embers into the dark, he whispered how these priests marked passages with stones instead of crosses, and how, when danger crept too close or tongues grew reckless, he bound his maps in the skins of sheep, delicate, secretive, easier to vanish than parchment or slate. Dave would hang on those words, thinking of how the sheepkin scrap in his own kit felt warmer, somehow, than any old relic had the right to be. Yet the herder always finished with a warning chiseled in the roughness of his voice. The sheepkin map was only the start. The treasure's path, he swore, twisted deeper, not toward gold itself, but toward a stone marker, a hidden map enduring far longer than any paper trail could survive. The days that followed blurred in a swirl of copper grass and the dull ringing of Dave's shovel against what lay buried. West Texas offered little shade, less mercy. Each morning, the scent of sun-baked earth clawed its way through camp, stronger even than the smoke off Dave's metal mug, where coffee sat thick as oil. Thick, dust-laden winds carried rumors as easily as seeds. On these currents, the story of Spider Rock returned again and again, sometimes louder than hope, sometimes just an ache beneath the skin of the land. Down in the arid river valleys, Dave dragged his boots, feeling every mile. Yet it was not just distance he measured, but the spaces between certainty and suspicion. Sometimes, when the light stung his eyes and sweat pooled at the back of his neck, Dave wondered if obsession was just another kind of thirst, left unquenched by water or reason. But each time doubt threatened, the herder would appear, his silhouette inked against the low horizon, ready to drop a fresh scrap of legend at Dave's feet. He claimed that the second map waited on Spider Rock itself. Not painted, not drawn, but carved. The kind of work you could read with fingertips after the sunset and hope had gone thin. The herder called it the most intricate of any he'd ever heard about. He said that men who'd laid eyes on it came away changed, marking time as before or after the sight. He called it a tablet of riddles, not just a map, but a history wound into stone, its meaning teasing at the boundaries between gospel and myth. One dawn, slivers of pink and gold broke open the night. The flames beneath Dave's coffee guttered, barely keeping off the morning chill. He packed his tools, trowel, brush, battered pickaxe, and picked his way up the knuckled base of a ridge. The wind pulled at his shirt, dragging dust in eddies that erased his footprints as fast as he made him. He could taste the metal tang of the soil. Under scuffed boots, the land thrummed, a low, patient hum that seemed calibrated to the hunt. It felt as if every part of the West Texas wilds contained some smeared thumbprint of stories, left there by those who had come before, chasing the same hunger for answers. Dave and the herder trudged along a dry arroyo. A thin trail wove through mesquite and prickly pear. The only company, a black vulture arcing slow circles overhead. As noon slid closer, heat shimmered above the rock faces. The herder's words, so full of warning at night, grew sparse under the raw glare. He pointed out the broad sweep of flats that cradled the local towns, his adobe and wood facades chipped by sandstorms and time. Once he stopped and jabbed a gnarled finger at a quartz pebble, half buried. The map, he insisted again, would not be found in ink or hide. Stone remembers what paper forgets, he said, in a voice so soft it got lost with the breeze. By the time Spider Rock came into view, a sun-bleached outcrop standing stubborn against the battered sky, Dave felt adrenaline pulse through the dull ache in his limbs. Copper veins chased the surface, catching the noon glare with a flare that looked almost like a signal. He crouched low, brushing away brittle thorns and caked soil, and then pressed his tongue between his teeth, feeling for a seam or mark. Beneath a tailless shelf, the earth parted grudgingly. With each brushstroke, cryptic lines emerged, curves and glyphs, some worn illegible by wind, others sharp enough to snare the sun itself. It was, indeed, the most elaborately decorated rock Dave had ever seen. Patterns wove over its body in a language only time itself could pronounce. Some symbols echoed the looping script, rumored to have belonged to the Spanish friars, while others looked far older and stranger. Dave lingered over lines that curved under his thumb, deepening in places where someone, perhaps centuries ago, had pressed his tool with desperate intent. Each glyph carried the bite of obsession. As he read the carvings, a hush pressed down, so complete that even the whistle of the wind faded. He felt, acutely, the eyes of memory on his back. And yet, just as quickly, uncertainty cut through. Not a single clue, not even the faintest date or signature, hinted at when these markings had been shaped, or by whose hand. That afternoon, crawling beneath the mottled shade of the rock, Dave's pick struck something unexpected. The chime was different, metallic, but far too dull for coin. He and the herder knelt, grit stinging his knees, as he clawed shallow bowls in the ground. Copper fragments emerged, cold and green, oxidized, along with rough chunks of spent slag. The surface shimmered in the bruised light, each piece tangled in the scent of scorched minerals. They were not gold, but clues all the same. The sight whispered of lost industry, perhaps Spanish, perhaps older. It told a parallel story, a hint that these desolate plains once rang with the clang of smelting and the fevered hope of fortune. As that realization surfaced, a chill wound through Dave's resolve. Was the treasure here not gold at all, but evidence of something even stranger, buried beneath layers of folklore? With each copper scrap, each unreadable glyph, the stakes altered. Now it was not just about finding wealth, but preserving pieces of history, threatened by scavengers and the hunger of forgetting. A slip could mean ruin, not just for Dave's finances or reputation, but for the truth buried in these wind-swept bones of Texas. And yet, just as the night began curling up from the horizon, wrapping Spider Rock in its cold embrace, a final, disquieting sign twisted the thread of Dave's obsession tighter. At the base of a carved spiral, Dave traced a symbol so faint it seemed more bruise than mark. The herder leaned in, breath held, eyes wide. It was a shape neither could place, a secret tucked beneath the centuries. Perhaps a clue, perhaps a warning. The wind picked up again, dragging dust over his hands, masking everything he'd just uncovered. The land, it seemed, was not ready to offer up its answers, not yet, and with each new riddle, the boundary between legend and reality only grew thinner, daring Dave, and those who would follow, to venture further toward truths that might remain forever just out of reach. As the July sun burned into the river valley, Dave Arnold and Dr. Terrell moved slowly through the brambles along the San Saba, each step kicking up ochre clouds of dust that glittered in the razor-sharp light. Gnarled mesquite roots clawed at his boots, the air charged with the sharp, sun-baked scent of mesquite sap and dry soil. Somewhere in the sweep of wild Texas, hope and doubt wrestled in equal measure. Neither man would admit it aloud, but that morning felt less like history and more like haunting, a drumbeat beneath the ordinary, insistent for answers that might not exist. He scoured the river's edge, boots sinking into gritty silt that held the memory of vanished floods. At last, half swallowed by wind-carved sand, the first of the legendary stones emerged, a weathered slab scoured nearly bare except for a handful of stubbornly preserved carvings. Terrell's voice dropped to an awed hush. He brushed away a crust of dust with the back of his hand, revealing a hieroglyphic shaped like an H, its grooves packed with grit. In the merciless sunlight, the mark felt not just deliberate, but almost defiant. A signpost for those stubborn or lucky enough to see it. For the outside world, it was just an old mark in stone, signifying nothing. But for Dave since childhood, tales of the lost Spanish gold had always circled back to such symbols, ancient guides left by men who trusted stone over paper and secrecy above all. Tyrrell traced each line with a careful fingertip, calluses mapping every loop. "It's not just a letter," he said, the words sticking in the dry air. "It's a direction, maybe a warning." Dave's mind raced. Was it a boundary? A plea? Or a promise of riches, buried deeper than bone? For a moment, only the hiss of wind through prairie grass filled the silence, as if the land itself refused to answer. Shoving aside the tangled sumac, he uncovered a second rock barely wider than a bread loaf. Its face was scrawled over with Roman numerals, cryptic numbers, and looping Spanish letters, etched so deep it seemed the stone had been cut open and marked from the inside out. The men traded theories in half, whispered arguments, voices brittle with excitement and strain. Tyrrell believed the numerals pointed to a date, perhaps the day of some bloody expedition gone wrong. Dave wondered if he were Pace's, a hidden recipe for uncovering the truth. Every guess felt flimsy in the unrelenting heat. Suddenly, a voice echoed from farther upstream. A member of the search party had found something in a tangle of willow and dry river cane. Scrambling to the spot, boots dragging through dust, he spotted what looked at first like bleached driftwood jutting from the riverbank. But as he closed in, muscles tight with anticipation, it became clear. Wedged among the roots and mud was a massive prehistoric bone, knobby and grey, weathered smooth as river glass. The bone was heavy, ancient, a relic from a beast that had vanished long before conquistadors dreamt of gold. Yet its presence, so close to those marked stones, soaked the air with superstition. Was it coincidence, or some grim token left to guard what lay beneath? Back at camp, Dave shifted uneasily beside Tyrrell as dusk swallowed the sun. The day's discoveries, the H-stone, the ciphered slab, that ancient bone, each gnawed at the edges of reason. He recalled stories he'd heard on sleepless prairie nights, rumors that not all guardians of treasure had been mercenaries or Spanish cavalry. Some believed the real keepers were Native American slaves, buried upright near the gold to anchor the restless spirit of the Hoard. The legend went that his bones stood eternal watch beneath the soil, deterring looters with the weight of curses older than the land itself. As night cloaked the little encampment, wind rattled through cottonwoods in mournful bursts. The teens' lanterns flickered, golden halos trembling across the scattered artifacts. When Tyrrell unwrapped a coarse burlap bundle, the group fell silent. Inside, resting in dust and candle glow, was a pair of silver epaulettes, ornate and tarnished, the embroidery nearly erased by centuries of neglect. He caught the lamplight in a sudden icy flash, an eerie glint against the darkness. "Spanish officers," Tyrrell murmured, voice hushed as though the silver might take offense. "Dropped in panic or buried with intent. It's anyone's guess." He set him down with care, his hands trembling more than he'd admit. For Dave, the epaulettes changed everything. No longer just fables spun at campfires now. There were objects with names and stories, evidence of men who had truly travelled these wilds and perhaps never returned. Once, the whole of Texas had seemed unbroken, endless, wild, untouched. Even now, in 1902, these desolate stretches were as untamed as legend painted him. Most of the West Texas wilds lay out beyond the thin reach of the law, a place where entire towns might vanish, and no telegraph line would ever record his passing. Those who chased fortune here often vanished in a stirring of dust, or returned home forever marked by obsession, a hard lesson writ in sunburn and sleeplessness. Yet the discoveries, cryptic as he were, only served to escalate the tension between the two men. Every mark in stone seemed to hint at a deeper code, a buried map within a map, designed to be impossible to solve. Arguments flared and receded, pushed by fatigue in the cruel bite of uncertainty. What if each stone was a decoy, a trick played by the original Spanish engineers to fool pursuers for centuries? Was the entire legend just a riddle wrapped around air, or did the weight of those artifacts prove something cold and undeniable hidden just beneath his feet? The light faded behind rolling clouds, washing the landscape in a bruised twilight. Insects rose in a thick, shimmering chorus. But as Dave passed the ciphered rock, his fingertips brushed a groove just deeper than the others. A single chip, almost invisible, but sharp as a dagger's scratch. He paused, chest tightening. Was it part of a lost symbol, or a sign that someone had scraped away vital information long ago? For a heartbeat, he was no longer standing in the open air, but inside a dark chamber, surrounded by secrets that pulsed beneath layers of stone and time. None of the men spoke as he packed away the day's finds. Shoulders stooped beneath an invisible burden. His discoveries that day had tipped legend into tangible reality. Yet every object only multiplied the number of unanswered questions. As cicadas soared harsh music into the night, Dave sat restless by the dying fire, doubting whether truth could ever really be separated from myth out here. He stared at the silver glint of the epaulets and the coded rocks, each a breadcrumb scattered across the midnight plain. Somewhere beyond the hush of the campfire and the steady churn of the river, he imagined the gaze of those first Spanish explorers, desperate, afraid, trusting only what the land would allow him to hide. He closed his eyes a moment, listening, not only for the whisper of gold, but for what might come next in the darkness. To the side, the faint sound of iron tools striking dirt began to stir. Someone was prepping to dig come morning, each metallic thud echoing beneath the big sky. Another threshold, another possibility. Was the next layer of earth the end of the journey? Or just another turn in a story that refused to give up its truths? The only answer, for now, was the scent of dust, the promise of one more dawn, and the hope that somewhere beneath his boots the stubborn legend of Spanish gold still waited, silent and alive. Iron pry bars tore at a stubborn vein in the West Texas earth, the clang of metal echoing across the shallow riverbank. With every shovelful of red-brown soil tossed aside, the legend hovered, spiderweb fine, almost impossible to grasp. The morning sun was already cruel, forcing sweat into gritty trails down Dave Arnold's neck. Still, hope surged among the men. To some, it was an ache in the gut. To others, a fever in his eyes. Nobody spoke much. Conversation dissolved in the hot hush between unearthing relics, and Dave felt the weight, not just of the tools in his hands, but of centuries of rumour beating like wings around him. A sharp clang startled the group. Dave knelt, calloused fingers brushing aside the final loose powder. There was slag, dull black pitted chunks that broke free from the soil with a reluctant snap, and flecks of copper glimmering in the morning light. The air shifted, heavy with the sharp scent of scorched metal that didn't belong in the remote Texas wilds. Every find was a clue, every clue, another cryptic line in a story that refused to speak its full truth. Not 10 feet farther upstream, Ben, a wiry ranch hand with dust-paneled boots, staggered back, holding up something he'd unearthed completely by accident. It was a flat stone, smooth as driftwood, and oddly cold. Beneath it, Dave's heart thundered. He crouched low, digging out 3 objects from where he rested: a copper dagger dulled green by age, a square with serrated edges, and an ornate key, bright where a bit of earth had left its imprint. The key's bow twisted in a shape unfamiliar, even to Dave's collector's eye. He rolled it between his fingers, and the sun flared off copper's warmth. The scent of river minerals clung stubbornly to his hands, tangy, almost metallic. From a few feet away, Eli, a barrel-chested farmer with a nose hooked from too many brawls, watched the relics glitter, suspicion alive in his heavy brow. Spanish? Or some kind of trader's work? He muttered. Dave shrugged. There was no sign of gold, no jewelry, nothing that matched the fevered tales of lost Spanish treasure. Just old copper, half melted or hammered thin by hands that belonged to another time. The infamous Spanish doubloons, rumoured to have been buried beneath this sunburned plain, remained out of reach. For a moment, silence held him all still. The wild landscape pressed in, the scouring wind, the relentless ticking of insects, the burnt scent rising from cracked river stones. That desperate hush, pierced only by the sound of breath and shifting dirt, seemed to mock the men's hopes as much as it tempted him forward. Maybe it was all a smelter's camp, Eli grumbled, brushing dust from his palms. Not a treasure, just a ghost of work long done. But Dave, his thumb running over the notched square, kept his doubts to himself. The notches were deep and deliberate. Had someone marked a code here, a map, a tally, or a warning? The threat and allure of the legend twisted together, winding around his mind, far beyond the river's bend. The dying memory of Spanish expeditions haunted every roll of these hills. Here, in the early years of the 20th century, the myth had already outlived several lifetimes, but it clung to the land like drought. Suddenly, a sharp whistle cut across the plain. The sheepherder, whom he had hired to watch the flock and sometimes the camp, emerged at the crest of a low rise, his shadow stretched long by afternoon light. He tugged his battered hat low, eyes flitting between the river, the men, and the line of live oaks to the west. He was a quiet figure, half rumour, half companion, drifting through the camp at odd hours. The last few days, the others whispered more and more about his motives. "It was him that pointed us here," Ben mumbled one night as the fire cracked low. "Maybe he wants the gold for himself." There weren't many rules out here in the wild. Only that gold made enemies of friends and strangers alike. Yet as the day wore on, Dave found the sheepherder had vanished. His blankets were still rolled beside the fire pit, his boots missing from the circle of dust by the horses. The only sign of his passing was a new boot print at the edge of the embankment, half buried by a gust of loose grit. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The sun hung low now, casting everything in hard relief. Dave felt the temperature of the dig drop. Around him, mutterings grew sharper, suspicion seeping into every glance, every motion. Had the sheep herder taken something he missed? Had he found a clue among the copper, another map, or perhaps a cipher, leading away from Spider Rock itself? The landscape swallowed any answers. In the dying light, the relics gathered on a canvas spread, a copper dagger, a battered key, the notched square, told his own story, mute and incomplete. Dust-laden wind chased along the riverbank, fierce and urgent. Somewhere beneath the surface, the scent of sun-baked earth warred with fleeting hints of fire and metal. Dave pressed his thumbs along the strange notches once more. The decision to dig deeper, or to admit defeat, weighed heavier with each passing hour. Legend had it that Spanish treasure was always just out of reach. For centuries, Texas stories echoed with lost fortunes, gold mines, sunken arks, a conquistador's ransom traded for freedom or buried in secret. But each clue seemed to twist the story further from certainty, as if the land itself wished to keep its secrets. Night fell quickly along the banks. Campfire smoke drifted in slow spirals. The men passed the copper finds from hand to hand, arguments rising over the meaning of the relics. Eli insisted he'd stumbled on Old Forge's grounds, a place where traders or outlaws had hidden his handiwork. Ben, always restless for more, pointed to the shape of the key, its elaborate bow unlike anything from local trading posts. Dave, for his part, stared at the notched square until the pattern blurred. Was it a symbol left by Spanish surveyors, or something far older, another tribe's warning nicked into copper and left for wanderers to find? Twice Dave thought he heard the distant whistle of the sheep herder, carried faint on the midnight wind. The fire hunched low. From the darkness, the ageless hum of the wild stretched, coyotes calling over the flat, open plain, the rustle of leaves hiding what could not yet be found. All around, the stakes grew heavier. Either the team would unravel the buried truth of Spider Rock, or he would sink into the legend's grip, another group lost, chasing shadows through dust. Each day, the obsession tightened its hold. Each find, every absence, felt more significant, more personal. The risk was no longer just about fortunes unearthed, but about minds and fates reshaped by the chase. As dawn threatened the horizon and silence spun itself thicker, Dave traced the notched square's edges, restless and uncertain. Had he uncovered the first true pieces of an ancient industry, or only another layer in Spider Rock's endless deception? From tightly packed earth, the team uncovered a slab slick with age, its surface a maze of concentric circles, archaic numerals, and scrawled Spanish letters. The night's failures and the legend's tightening snare lingered behind every glint of copper, every muffle of wind along the banks. Somewhere, the beginning of another twist waited, silent, hidden, ready for dawn. West Texas in the grip of late summer. Evening pressed close, the sun pulling color from the plains, casting every shadow long and uncertain. The team's camp was a scatter of battered canvas, pickaxes, and rust-hinged lanterns, clustered at the lip of a dry river valley. Dave Arnold knelt, sweat painting a line along his brow, as the last shovel finally yielded to something hunched and solid in the dirt. With the hush of anticipation crowding in, Dave's hands brushed aside gritty ochre dust. Cold stone greeted his fingers. The slab was slick with unreachable years, and its face erupted with a maze of etched curves, archaic marks that clawed through old mineral stains. At dusk, candlelight from a lantern caught the earliest glint. A spiral, an almost hypnotic set of concentric circles swirling out from the slab's heart, as if to pull the team's very breath into its orbit. And riding the edge, quarried deep into the side, the distinct arms of a weathered letter. H stood in harsh relief, a hieroglyph raised on raw stone, both a beacon and a warning. Every movement sent up faint whirls of earth, carrying with him the sun-baked scent of dust and secrets. The wind seemed to lean closer as the symbols emerged. Roman numerals crawled along the slab's lower flank, his grooves choked with time, numbers, some half-swallowed by lichen, sidled up to scrawled Spanish letters, pleas and taunts in an abandoned tongue. Each mark pressed inward, driving the observers to imagine centuries of desperate hands laboring over this very stone. Curiosity and uncertainty roiled, threatening to spill over. Dave's eyes tracked every carving, his flashlight beam darting from line to circle, the images fracturing beneath inspection. For a moment he felt dizzy, caught between a sense of imminent revelation and the prickling warning that the stone might mislead more than it ever unveiled. The crowd of onlookers, herders, and hands from a nearby ranch town would later recall the slab as nothing he'd ever seen. A surface so packed with elaborate symbols, it seemed to promise madness or fortune in equal measure. The stone's chill warped into Dave's bones, even as the summer air clung thick about him. He pressed the pads of his fingers along the lines, tracing where the hieroglyphic H rose amid other cryptic marks, each ridge stubborn, cut so deep as to resist centuries of sediment and blowing sand. Along its edge, the numerals hooked toward a set of tightly scrawled Spanish capitals, almost pleading in his insistence. A sheep herder squatted nearby, his words rough but urgent. He insisted again that the odd pattern mirrored the shapes found on the faded sheepkin map, and that this stone, itself a map, should reveal a second guide, perhaps deeper in the lost bends of the river. The idea that the old animal hide pointed to a stone map somewhere here had been the team's obsession for weeks. Now, with evidence beneath his fingertips, hope and doubt warred in every face. 19 measured paces away, between baked crevices where grass gave up to the stones, another discovery jerked the moment rightward. A labourer's exclamation turned every head. He'd unearthed a bone the length of a man's arm, ancient and sun-bleached, curled by centuries in the ground. Dave stooped over it, elbows sinking into loose soil. The bone's surface had a fossil sheen, milky and heavy, impossible to ignore. Was this some prehistoric witness to the stone's story, or a warning planted by fate itself? The team's excitement surged into debate. Light pooled against the slab's surface, breaking up the dusk. As the wind stuttered through the little camp, a new wave of doubt spilled in alongside hope. What was this place? A forgotten Spanish trove, or simply a resting spot for ancient bones and nearer legends? Dave clung to the line of symbols spiraling across stone. Was the concentric pattern meant to suggest a place, a passage, or something else? perhaps a warning, encoded by men, desperate to keep his gold hidden from all but the most determined seeker. He pressed his cheek closer, the stone's skin cool beneath the fever brewing in his mind. One of the ranch hands strung a lantern up on a broken cedar post, light refracted in the glass, scattering gold flecks across dust swirling at his ankles. The air tasted of copper and sun-warped sage. Each movement, every hush, felt wrapped in the tension of discovery, of standing on the hinge of some secret history. The men breathed in unison, dust motes tumbling in and out of the lantern beam. Dave barely noticed the ache in his knees or the tremble in his hands as he followed lines from the hieroglyphic H outward, past numerals that seemed to beg for a key. If there was a cipher here, it remained stubbornly hidden, locked away behind layers of intent and erasure. In the stone's center, someone had carved a deep hollow, a shallow bowl worn smooth by time and wind alike. Inspecting it by lamplight, Dave wondered if this was a marker, a place to leave something or retrieve it. When he placed his palm over it, the surface felt impossibly cold. Around the rim, the Spanish letters shimmered under the shifting light, teasing out half-meanings, promises of further riddles. Another gust rolled in, heavier this time, spinning a low whistle through the grass at his feet. The valley seemed to lean in, listening. In that moment, the teen's fever dulled. Uncertainty stretched long and thin across every face, his silhouettes caught in the flicker of firelight. Nobody spoke for a spell. It was as if the rock itself had sucked up the air, demanding silence and respect. Yet, even in stillness, the team's obsession grew. Daylight faded to shadows, dust settled over evidence and half-truth, and the breeze carried with it 1,000 more unasked questions. As the final lamplight played across the loaded surface of the carved rock, Dave's gaze fell to a single scratch along the stone's corner, less elaborate, almost like an afterthought. He traced it, uncertain if it was an overlooked clue or just the wound of time. One herder offered a new theory in a half-whisper. What if the slab symbols weren't a map at all, but a curse? The others watched Dave, searching for a hint of belief or nerves. Was it possible that what he'd uncovered had been meant to mislead, to bait the reckless with hope, keeping any true fortune forever one step beyond reach? Yet even as doubts circled, the stone was undeniable, elaborate, deliberate, and haunting. It stood as proof of someone's story, if not yet the Spanish gold itself. West Texas held its secrets tight as the darkness pressed in. Through the swirl of dust and the sizzle of wind in brittle grass, the carved rock seemed to whisper anew, its secrets just out of reach, its meaning still heavy beneath years of rumor and wanting. And as the night deepened, it was clear, for every answer the slab pretended to offer, another riddle stepped up to take its place. Just as the search threatened to yield more, the clues grew thin and the dig went still, leaving Dave Arnold and his team perched on the edge of another long shadow, wondering what else the land had hidden, or promised, or betrayed. The sun dipped low across the flat West Texas horizon, its orange fire smothered under a curtain of dusky heat. Wind pressed at the tents, pushing dust in restless tides between boots and bedrolls. For Dave Arnold, every slow scrape of his trowel echoed as both progress and warning. The dig site had begun as pure promise, a chance to seize the legend of Spider Rock and prove Spanish gold was not just a fireside yarn for desperate men. But over days spent clawing at crumbling clay and shivering beneath the ceaseless whistle of wind, hope took on a peculiar taste, something metallic and faintly bitter, like the scent of the earth after lightning. It had been days since the last hint of treasure sparked through the soil. The crew, faces dulled by sun and fatigue, spoke less. Sifted dirt revealed only old fragments, a buckle here, the curve of a musket ball there. No gold doubloons winked from beneath layers of ancient silt, and each find raised more questions than answers. Nearby, Dr. Terrell's journal pages fluttered in the breeze, his hands always busy comparing faint map sketches with the jagged shapes carved into the stone. The team could sense it, momentum faltering, patience thinning, hope skidding close to resignation. If trust was fried brittle by the Texas sun, suspicion simmered quietly beneath the surface. The sheepherder, whose roundabout tales and uncanny knowledge of Spider Rock had drawn everyone in, grew more evasive with each passing day. He provided maps traced in shaky charcoal and whispered of Spanish patrols weaving through canyons. Some, like Garrison the jack-of-all-trades, muttered at mealtime that the herder's hidden motives might be sharper than any digging tool. Was he wondered, trailing his own path to the treasure beneath his distracted noses, waiting for the right moment to vanish with the loot? No accusation ever found voice, yet glances grew pointed and short words peppered the quiet. The sheepherder began keeping odd hours, rising earlier than the rest to wander the boulder-strewn canyons, pausing near Spider Rock's looming shadow far longer than tasks required. Dave watched these movements from the edge of camp, each dawn tinged with a pulse of paranoia he tried, and failed, to smother. In the heat-struck lull of one afternoon, the herder's bedroll lay empty and collapsed, his battered tin cup still half filled with cold creek water. Not a soul had seen him go. His path, if he'd left one at all, was swept clean by the wind. The only sign was a single sheep track pressed deep at the edge of camp, and a growing chorus of angry whispers. The mood shifted. Where once there was purpose, now came unease. The silence seemed to thicken, broken only by the rasp of steel on stone, and the low, tense questions spoken around sputtering lanterns. Had the sheepherder simply tired of endless digging and vanished for greener pastures? Or was it the pull of old gold, of stories that promised a fortune and delivered only shadows, that sent him fleeing into the vastness? At dawn the very next morning, as Dave stalked the riverbank lost in thought, Lorenzo, the youngest on the crew, unearthed something sharp from a collapsed burrow beneath a hackberry tree. The object, glinting silver even beneath dust, snapped everyone from his gloom. Dave knelt first to examine it, brushing dry soil from jagged corners with the familiar care of a hopeful man. 2 matching pieces, heavy in hand and scalloped along his edges, epaulettes likely meant for a Spanish officer's shoulders. The sensation of possibility returned, humming against Dave's skin. He ran his calloused fingers over the filigree, thinking of orders barked across the plains by men long gone, the coin-bright flash of uniforms that had once marched along these forgotten river valleys. There was danger in hope, but also a kind of hunger, a yearning to believe that something of the legend still lay within reach. That single find changed everything. if only for a moment. Men squinted closer at the soil. Shovels drifted from the main trench onto wild, scribbled new grids. The air snapped with the scent of hot metal and the sharp tang of sweat, each movement leaving swirls of dust against the bare skin of wrists. As the digging intensified, Dr. Terrell spent his hours hunched over the Spanish maps and field notes he'd collected, chasing every cryptic line and faded annotation. Some claimed that the Spider Rocks himself watched silently, complicit in every hope and failure, his web-like shadows stretching long at dusk. Yet, as so often happens in the unforgiving wilds near Spider Rock, a discovery could cut two ways. Within days, the weight of chance made itself felt with a cruel turn, markings appearing on the flat underside of a river boulder, glyphs scratched in a language neither Spanish nor English, yet oddly familiar. Dr. Terrell traced the shapes, his fingers trembling with excitement. Was this a clue etched by the same patrol that once wore those epaulets, or a warning from those who had vanished before? For Dave, the find straddled the border between revelation and another descent into myth. The dust that clung to his skin felt heavier than ever, anchoring him both to the land and to the doubts that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Legend speaks often of Spanish fortunes lost in the vastness of Texas, but the stories rarely mention the obsessions these quests breed, or the way rumor twists into motive. Dave's world became smaller, yet stranger, as he tried to fit each discovery, the strange symbols, the vanished herder, the empty wallet of riverbank soil, into a single narrative. Sometimes, at dusk, he would stand apart from camp and listen for echoes. Was there really gold to be found, or only the lure of legend itself? With each passing evening, anxiety grew thick as the dust in the air. Still, no one could bring himself to leave. Dave and Dr. Terrell, partners now in both risk and obsession, worked deep into the lamplit hours, his outlines hunched and spectral in the orange haze of a kerosene glow. The Spider Rock legend, it seemed, would not surrender its secrets without extracting a personal toll. In the distance, wind pushed over the plain with a high, plaintive whistle, scattering grit and memory alike. Trust suspended in the long pause before nightfall, every footstep feeding the question, even with new clues, was the trail truly leading onward, or spiraling back into the same web of promises and betrayals that had haunted this land for centuries? As the last lantern flickered against the black, Dave could only stare into the nothing. Somewhere past the jagged rim of the stone overhang, he felt fate drawing him toward a fresh disturbance, a brittle patch of ground where rumors of tragedy and buried secrets waited, untouched by hand or shovel or sun. The riddle deepened, the shadow of Spider Rock stretching farther into the unknown. The sun had barely crested the ridge when the echoes of last night's tales still clung to the men's minds, bleeding into the waking world. Dust drifted through bands of early light near the overhang. Every footstep ground the parched detritus of centuries under leather boots. Dave Arnold knelt low, shadow thrown sharp across the broken stones, hands working gently, careful not to disturb what might have lain hidden since the first Spanish hoofprints ever marked this grim patch of West Texas. His shovels had struck something hours ago, a resistance deeper down, reluctant to rise. Now the earth fell away in handfuls, An ashen cloth appeared. The shreds faded to a colorless memory, stubbornly wrapped around brittle bone. The stillness collapsed. A great soured stench surged up, worse even than his tales had warned. Each man reeled, covering nose and mouth, the metallic scent of old death fighting with the sun-baked aroma of the land. He had found what the herder spoke of, bodies, sealed in dust, out here where only the driven or the doomed ever dug. Dave forced himself to look. He picked apart layers of ancient fabric and crumbling leather, fingers tracing the lines of a skull pressed to the dust. There were 3 of him, one tiny, curled, and almost childlike, but for its unyielding silence the rest long-limbed and arranged as though to bar the way forward. The explorer's tools lay forgotten on the stone. For a moment the team froze. No one dared speak above the dry, insistent whisper of the wind. The legend returned, curling at the back of Dave's mind, that these dead were not mere casualties of fortune, but chosen as guardians. Slaves, so the story said, bound to the darkness below, sacrificed to tie some restless spirit to the treasure. As he worked, a voice trembled from the shadows, one of the hired hands, the skinny-eyed Mexican, his hat in his hands like a penitent's crown. He swore on his mother's grave. These bodies were not left by accident, but set here by priests, conspirators in robes and silver rings, who knew secrets an ocean away. His words were lost on some, but Dave's skin prickled. He remembered the sheep herder, the man who first led him toward Spider Rock, pacing restlessly in the background. That herder had claimed to know the story's true heart, a cache of Spanish gold hidden by the cruel hands of faith and desperation, its secret mapped not in words, but in the twisted sign language of rocks and scars carved deep in the land. The atmosphere thickened. Traces of rot clung to every movement, and still Dave forced himself onward. His fingers pushed against the packed debris, and beneath his calloused palm he felt a jagged mark in the stone, almost a petroglyph, but not quite. The lines looked deliberate, looping with drips of iron residue, still rust-red after untold seasons. He beckoned the teen closer. As each man peered down, arguments ignited. Was this a symbol, or just the witless scarring of erosion by wind and time? No one seemed able to say. Even old Thomas, who had lived by these arroyos since childhood, only shook his head. These pictorial codes on the rocks defied every scrap of Spanish, Apache, or digger lore he possessed. The marks, half buried, suggested a path or a warning, or perhaps nothing at all. Theories jostled against fear. In this part of Texas, the muted hubbub of a 1900s cow town felt a world away. Here, all signs were written in the language of the sun and the sand, secrets pressed under the relentless wind. As the morning unraveled into harsh noon, beads of sweat stung eyes and the hum of insects hovered over the dig. The overhang threw a slice of shadow, the only comfort. Dave pawed at a patch of earth near the bodies, watching as a silvery glint emerged. A coin, worn except for the faint impression of a cross, almost crumbled by centuries of river silt. But the clues the team needed were not on the coin, nor on Spider Rock itself. There was no date chipped into stone, no name, no indication of when these whispered horrors had been bound here, or by whose hand. The only certainty was the palpable weight that hung over the dig, thicker even than the Texas heat. Every scoop of soil seemed to draw him further away from solid answers. Tension bled into irritation. One of the younger men, spooked by every shifting shadow, accused the old sheep herder of leading him around in circles. But the herder only pointed silently east. On a distant rise, shaped like the back of some sleeping beast, a copse of twisted mesquite hunched beneath the sky. There, the herder swore, was a marking. He claimed, in a voice hoarse with conviction, that a symbol etched in stone atop that little hill meant the real prize, Spanish treasure, was buried nearby. That set the group on edge. Some wanted to press on, to quit this grisly business with the dead, and chase the lure of gold while the sun still granted him time. Others, shaken by what he'd disturbed, argued for caution, if not outright retreat. The found bodies, and what he represented, clung to every footfall, an unshakable warning, impossible to ignore. The wind picked up, sifting dust into every fold of clothing, bringing with it the bitter, baked sweet aroma of dry grass, the faintest tang of blood and rust from the broken ground. Dave moved away from the overhang, silent, eyes set to the horizon. If the legends were true, his map was only partially uncovered, riddles still encoded in shapes beneath caked soil and centuries-old marks. The valley fell silent again, broken only by the high, lonesome cry of a bird far overhead. Uncertainty pressed in on all sides. That night no one slept well. The darkness pooled at the edge of the campfire, pushing every memory of the day's discoveries forward again and again. The bodies, the whispered curses, the promise of riches buried deeper still. Each man turned over the same question in his head. Had he just stumbled across restless victims, or trespassed into the jealous embrace of something greater and more treacherous? And if there truly was a Spanish fortune sunken beneath these West Texas valleys, would it ever willingly let itself be found? Under starlight, the fire spat and hissed, the scent of char and scorched sage curling through the night. Dave watched embers swirl upward, his hands still caked with the dust of the dead. He could feel the mark under his thumb, a riddle waiting to be unraveled, if he dared. Come dawn, the ground would yield new secrets, whether the team willed it or not. For 19 paces away, where moonlight slipped across brittle grasses, the earth guarded something even stranger, a bone, massive and ancient beyond reckoning, pressed among fresh impressions of more recent burials. But for now, in the hush before sunrise, the unanswered questions hovered, silent, heavy, and irresistible. At that same spot, 19 paces from the ragged wound in the earth, Dave Arnold crouched in the waning ochre light, his breath shallow and rough, eyes intent on the mottled ground beneath his boots. The wind dragged bitter dust through the arid river valley, carrying the scent of sun-baked limestone and something older. A coppery tang that clung to the tongue, thick with promise and warning. His hands trembled slightly as he brushed away the last layer of clay from the pale arc that had emerged. A bone so massive it seemed at odds with the scraggly world around it. Prehistoric, one of the men muttered quietly behind him. The word hung in the air, both explanation and accusation, swirling alongside the sigh of the river beyond the brush. For a moment, every detail sharpened. The sweat on Dave's brow, the shriek of a distant hawk, the crunch of stone under the slow, deliberate movement of his team. Nearby, sunlight caught on the edge of something dull, yet unmistakably fashioned, a glimmer among the rocks. Dave reached, coaxing loose the object with practiced care. In his palm, the tarnished span of silver epaulettes lay heavy, his filigree etched with a pattern only the most patient centuries could blur. Traces of old rank, officers, and vanished authority seemed to haunt him. One of the men, Salas, let out a low whistle, his Spanish inflected softly. Could he be from a captain, hidden away with more than just intentions? Most relics he'd unburied so far had hinted at calamity or hasty departure, but these were deliberate, an emblem, perhaps, of those who never returned to collect what mattered most. Around the main dig site, the ground showed a story written in crushed impressions and fractured clues. Lodged just beneath a small flat stone, 3 copper ornaments had lain undisturbed for centuries, a slim dagger, green with patina, beside a stubby notched square and a dark, oddly ornate key. Each piece was worn thin, but he fit together as if meant to be discovered together, interlocked by more than just burial. Dave turned him in his hands, his surfaces alive with cryptic marks that pressed into his calloused fingertips. Were he charms, offerings, simple tools, or fragments of something else? A coded message lost to time. The deeper he dug, the more ambiguous the finds became, neither wholly Spanish nor plainly natural. Every item resisted easy explanation. A copper dagger was not unusual for older native tribes, but its hilt bore a sigil almost Spanish, and not found in any record Dave could recall. The notched square resembled a counting tool, the sort referenced in faded tomes of colonial ledger-keeping, but made of metal too thick, too deliberate, to be accidental. The key was the oddest, its teeth carved with a rudimentary cross. Was it for a strong box, a chapel, a door that had long since vanished into dust? None could say. As sunset bled across the valley, setting fire to the ragged cliffs and painting Spider Rock in long, shifting shadows, the team felt the press of both history and myth. Dust-laden wind cut through camp, stirring tents and sifting grit into every crease of clothing. Dave imagined the original architects of this cache, Spaniards desperate, betrayed, or simply opportunistic in his bid for gold and escape. Somewhere nearby, a sheep herder's trail cut through the grass, winding toward the edge of the dig. Townsfolk in the nearest settlement spoke his name only in fragments, wary of his ambitions, some convinced he'd conspired to keep the gold for himself. Rumors swelled in the bars at twilight. The shepherd, knowing far more than he let on, had whispered to a few that even the Mexican priests had left signals among the rocks for those taught to read him. Dave couldn't escape the feeling that he stood on the threshold of something just beyond reach. At times, the river's murmur seemed to form words, syllables that might decode the legend if only heard in the right order. He knelt where the silver epaulettes had lain, feeling the memory of a vanished officer pressing coldly through more than a century. There was no clue, no date, no unmistakable mark on the great sandstone pillar known as Spider Rock. Its face bore only crude carvings, some so eroded by wind he barely caught the light at all. If the legend was true, the original architects left his secrets shrouded in silence. Some claimed the Spanish never truly hid treasure here, that each trinket was a clever distraction left by later hands. Yet every new find threatened to tip Dave deeper into the quicksand of obsession. By the fire, as nighttime pressed in, Dave's tired hands turned each artifact over and over, seeking answers in tarnished metal and the slick, ancient feel of bone. The prehistoric fragment, once set among antediluvian herds that thundered across what would one day be Texas, now lay beside glinting silver and weathered copper. The juxtaposition blurred the story. Spanish gold, prehistoric beasts, cryptic relics, all dancing just beyond the fingertips of certainty. Was this place truly the hiding ground of a lost fortune, or merely the crossroads of layered histories, each one clutching at the next, obscuring everything in the process? A gust of wind rattled the tent's edge, lifting the canvas and slapping it back down, dragging with it the metallic scent of rain yet to arrive. Salas threw another mesquite branch onto the fire. The team sat in a loose circle, eyes on the flames, nervous laughter swirling with the smoke. Dave had grown gaunt of late, sleep hollowed out beneath his eyes, not by physical exertion, but by the looping fever of the hunt. Even as the comfort of firelight touched the tumbled copper ornaments, a sense of defeat pressed in. These were not prizes, but partial confessions, tokens of a story that chose to remain hidden. Still, he felt the cold thrill of a gambler holding an incomplete hand, certain that the next card would spell either fortune or ruin. Just as the night threatened to swallow every certainty, another pattern shattered the monotony. Arturo, the youngest of the team, and always the one to catch what others missed, called out from near the stone slab he'd unearthed at midday. His voice cracked through the haze. Here was something, pressed almost invisible into the rock's edge. A swirl, maybe a crude sigil, possibly the faint remains of a Spanish letter. Was it accidental, or the last message from a doomed officer marking the grave of impossible riches? The light from Dave's lantern tangled across the clues as the others gathered, the river fog rolling in, thick as secrets he could taste on his tongues. Wrapped in darkness and hope, the team's doubts seemed to fray and strengthen in equal measure. Each discovery brought a rush, then a stall, then a surge of new questions. Whose fortune did Spider Rock truly shield, imperial, ecclesiastical, or personal, shadowed by fear and greed? Dave's hand pressed trembling against the rock, fingertips brushing the cryptic etching, moisture rising in the night, as if the stone itself exhaled its ancient, unfinished story. No map, no diary, no whispered confession had yet told the whole truth. He was simply the latest pilgrim at the edge of the unknown, his own fears and convictions written into the dirt beside the relics. Dave Arnold held his hat firm against the relentless West Texas wind, boots anchored in the thin scrub above an eroded, sun-bleached hill. The place looked ordinary from afar, just a low swell, flanked by scraggly cedar trees and coarse, stripped grass burnt blonde under the sky. But as noon approached, the light fell in such a way that stone shapes half buried in the soil began to shimmer with suggestion, hinting at purpose older than any memory. He reached the weather-worn flank of what the local sheep-herder had once showed him, a chunk of sandstone pressed with a faded marker, part cross, part spiral, its meaning layered and uncertain. Years had passed since that story, since whispers of Spanish gold had tangled with his own restless ambition. Yet the details replayed in his mind each time his fingers hovered over mysterious grooves carved by hands now lost to history. 7 Texas summers had come and gone, across the wide country west of the Pecos, and every season left deeper grooves in Dave Arnold's face. His cheeks had been tanned and burned by the sun so often that most folks in the crumbling town of Sanderson thought of him as part of the landscape itself, a permanent fixture, unchanged even as trains began replacing horse-drawn wagons, and the valleys saw less and less of the bustling cattle drives that once passed through. Each early morning, before the heat gathered enough strength to shimmer above the river stones, Dave's boots traced the familiar crunch of wagon paths now grown pale and dry. In his wake trailed a thin dust, and sometimes a pair of young laborers or an old friend from better days, men drawn to the Spider Rock legend like moths to a late-night lantern. His breath mingled with the sharp scent of sun-baked earth. Dave barely noticed his idle chatter anymore. His own thoughts ran circles around every clue, every whispered rumor about the Spanish gold, hidden somewhere past the shadow. Spider Rock threw across the land at dawn. His fingertips bore the stories, rough and scarred from years spent turning over river stones, combing through breach after breach he'd carved into slopes of ochre soil, certain that if he just followed the right path, he'd find what others had only dared to imagine. But 7 years of failure make a man restless. Each night, as the wind funneled up the empty valley and hissed against cracked window panes, Dave pressed himself to remember details. Had he missed some pattern in the markings set deep in the cave walls north of the riverbank? Was that cross shape truly Spanish, or just a trick of lichen and age? Obsession lived in such details, the sort of conviction that sharpens with every rebuff. The line between belief and madness is invisible until it is far too late. One June day, the teen struck something he almost missed, a flash soft as starlight beneath a brittle shale layer near the old flood channel. The sound was gentle, like the chime of a bell heard from a distant chapel. But when Dave brushed away the powdered rock, his vision filled with the unmistakable gleam of silver, dulled and crusted by decades of earth and river silt. He lifted 2 crescent-shaped lumps out from the ground, silver epaulets, broad and elegant even beneath his grime. He held a dignity that defied the wild setting, the clear style of an old-world officer's uniform pinned to a phantom from centuries before. No one spoke for a long moment. The epaulets were proof, and yet incomplete, provoking more questions than answers. Who had lost him, and when? Why would such costly things be found here, miles from any known Spanish camp? Word of the find slipped out despite Dave's efforts to keep the discovery quiet. By dusk, a gaunt Mexican laborer, one whose stories changed shape depending on his audience, cautioned Dave against digging further. In a voice barely louder than the wind through the mesquite, he insisted that the soil sheltered something older still. The treasures guarded by spirits, he warned, flickering his eyes at the freshly dug trench. The man claimed that the bodies buried here were once native slaves, made to watch over gold he could never spend, doomed to patrol its secret for eternity. Some men on the team crossed himself, and the youngest spent an uneasy night sleeping with a lantern burning. But Dave felt only a restless thrill. If anything, the words tempted him further. A week later, a new puzzle appeared. Chipping out a mossy stone at the base of a rocky bluff, Dave's pick split open a shallow crevice. There, half caked in blackened soil, was a cornerstone neatly carved with a sequence of Roman numerals, jagged and deep as though marked by a determined hand. Alongside the numbers, faint Spanish letters spiraled into the rock's flaked surface, half erased by time and the dry, lashing wind. The air around the rock seemed to hang oddly still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. When Dave ran his fingertips over the markings, dust clung to his skin, and a metallic tang caught the back of his throat. He called the team over, hands trembling not just from excitement, but from the weight of what these carvings suggested. The possibility of a cipher, or a hidden map, something that might be decoded to lead deeper into the labyrinth of legend. Each clue, each artifact, sharpened the line between hope and delusion. Dave's nights became more fevered, filled with dreams of conquistadors dropping gold doubloons beneath Texas skies, of Spanish priests blessing hidden chests as retreating soldiers murmured his final prayers. Somewhere amid the crackle of campfire and the ceaseless wind, a hazy sense persisted. The farther he pushed, the less real the world outside Spider Rock became. The gold was now less a promise of riches than a grail, proof that beneath the legends told in every ranch house and roadside cafe, there survived a kernel of truth about the lost Spanish treasure. Yet for every find there was a setback. Late in July, a shaft collapsed feet from the carved stone, flooding the earth with a choking cloud so thick the men scrambled for daylight with burning eyes. One laborer, shaken and angry, swore Spider Rock was cursed and refused to return. As the rest of the team pulled the loosened boards and crushed canvas from the dig, Dave forced himself to keep going, working into the night by lantern light even as knotted shadows danced along the ravine. He squinted at the scrawled numerals in his notebook, certain the symbols on the stone were the map he needed. And yet, as the sun rose each morning, the landscape seemed to inch further away from anything certain. Shadows thrown by Spider Rock stretched long and crooked, warping the familiar valleys into wild, uncharted territory. On some windless dawns, Dave stood alone above the sleeping river, feeling the tickle of grit along his wrists and the echo of something ancient humming beneath his boots. The clues pointed in 3 different directions, but time was not on his side. Small towns nearby began to empty out. In Sanderson, faded advertisements for modern farm tools replaced the windows that once advertised supplies for gold hunters and dreamers. Even the distant train whistle sounded more final, a little goodbye to every obsession that was dying out with the century. Still, in the hush of first light, Dave pressed forward. He measured every field by the angle of Spider Rock's shadow and scrawled new hypotheses in the tiny ledger he kept tucked in his shirt pocket. He told himself that all the countless carved symbols, the handful of Spanish relics, and even the unearthed epaulets formed a tapestry with meaning still just beyond reach. But that confidence was eroding, grain by grain, like the valley sand the river carried away each spring. With every week, Dave felt luck turning against him, the enigma tightening. Time itself seemed to conspire to keep the Spanish treasure hidden and the legend alive. Twice he dreamed he'd solved it all, laying out the numerals, deciphering the curled Spanish letters, reading the map as clearly as an open field at noon. Both times, he awoke with the sun glaring in his eyes and the heavy ache of memory settling onto his chest. The truth danced along the edge of every honest effort, just close enough to catch a glimpse, but never close enough to claim. In those empty moments, with only the hush of dust swirling beneath the patient gaze of Spider Rock. Dave wondered, had the Spanish ever really left his gold at all? Or was the legend itself the lasting mark he'd carved into Texas? What endured when the diggers had gone was dust over the river valley, the sun's slow patience, the silence beneath Spider Rock. West Texas crawled into dusk with the same stubbornness that each day dragged itself over the battered river valley. The stamp of old wagon wheels and boot prints faded into the pale dust, as if the land insisted on erasing evidence, swallowing up every intrusion. By the spring of 1912, Dave Arnold's hunt was finished. The final dig had collapsed in on itself months before, leaving behind only scattered canvas, spoil heaps, and memories, half real, half hallucinated by the relentless sun. Yet for all the noise mankind made, silence reclaimed everything. Even those monumental marks cut into the stone, the strange, looping glyphs, half Moorish, half native, grew less and less decipherable. Sometimes, in the slowest hours, a lizard would scuttle across a symbol worn smooth by wind, and for a moment it would seem like the code itself was alive, resisting interpretation as fiercely as the landscape resisted water. At first glance, nothing remained except legend, but underneath the shallow skin of abandonment, Spider Rock still held the echo of secrets. It became a borderland, a place where the known twisted into rumor and facts curled into the shape of folklore. The last day Dave stood on that rise, the wind carried a dry, coppery tang, the mineral scent of earth upturned, as if treasure itself had exhaled. He'd been awake for 36 hours, eyes ringed with the madness of expectation and defeat. One hand still trembled as he pressed his palm into a cryptic carving he'd traced 1,000 times. In the hush, his calloused fingertips found old gouges and notched lines, some familiar, some new. The others had left days before. He alone remained, the last witness, staring down the gorge, feeling the raw truth that whatever the diggers had uncovered was never going to be enough. Gold, legend, even closure, all had proven as elusive as the first glint of dawn beyond the canyon walls. There had been discoveries, some odd, some chilling. Weeks before, under a flat stone, Dave's team unearthed 3 copper shapes, a slender dagger, a thick-barreled key, and a square marked by a jagged edge. The items were strange, unpolished, a crude puzzle in red-brown metal. The men argued over his purpose, but no one could explain who had left him there, or why these symbols would have been buried in this arrangement. It felt like a riddle, or perhaps a warning, a message from hands long vanished into dust. And not far from camp, a low, crumbling ledge had surrendered, what appeared to be a matched pair of silver epaulettes, tarnished but still catching the evening sun in glints of cold, spectral light. Some whispered these must have belonged to a Spanish officer mustered with his doomed expedition, outranked only by the silence left behind. For Dave, his presence proved something foreign had once moved through these canyons. It was a thread, fragile yet undeniable. But threads can lead in circles, and the gold, if it had ever existed, remained out of reach. Rumor pressed outward like the heat itself, thick and impossible to escape. Men travelling through nearby Pecos and the tumbleweed towns that ringed the area traded stories, sometimes quietly in corner booths, sometimes spurred by whiskey and summer storms. most remembered a Mexican laborer who told Dave, gaze-haunted, that the remains found near the dig didn't belong to soldiers at all. He were, by his telling, the bodies of native slaves, chained and left to become the guardians of the treasure's spirit. He warned that even if the gold were found, it would never belong to the living. Weeks stretched into months, each revelation more ambiguous than the last. The team's maps, marked in pencil and sweat, began to blur his own lines. What once looked like a trail now felt more like a knot, endless loops and intersections, leading only deeper into confusion. Dave, ever methodical, began tracing the marks with chalk late into the blackest hours, murmuring code and old Spanish curses under his breath. He followed each discovery with a burst of stubborn hope, and then a deeper skepticism. Was he missing a vital cipher, some overlooked sign pointing to the final cache? Or was the very idea of treasure, like the sun-baked mirages that shimmered each noonday, just a lure meant to pull men further from reason? The land offered no answers, only more hard days. The dust that choked the lungs and filled every crack of the old field cook-stove was constant. Sometimes Dave would kneel by a section of rubble, letting a handful of sand sift through his fingers. He listened for some ancient instruction, as if the wind itself might whisper coordinates. All he ever heard was the slow music of the breeze curling around the stone roots of Spider Rock. Then there was the memory that refused to fade. One evening, under a bruised sky, Dave watched as the diggers uncovered a strange grey mound. What he first thought was just a seam of darker soil yielded bones, aligned as if in sentinel formation, skulls tilted upwards, jawbones locked as though gasping for breath that would never return. No gold coins, no chests, just these mute, spectral guardians. The men grew uneasy, voices low. Nights after, no one dared approach that side of the camp. In the end, the mound was gently covered again, the air around it electric with unease. What endured, though, was not just what had been found, but what had not. The sun kept returning, indifferent, as years peeled by. Dave's search did not yield definitive treasure, only mysteries compounded, copper shapes without context, silver insignia with unreadable provenance, and the marks in stone that scholars would debate for decades. For the nearby towns, Spider Rock became a cautionary tale. Children dared each other to hike its trails by moonlight. Old-timers told stories on courthouse steps or in leaning frame, houses where the yellow lamplight warred with shadows. Some whispered that Dave Arnold himself had gone mad, still wandering the canyons in dreams, forever clutching a crumbling map marked with code. But the real truth lay somewhere between memory and meaning. The river valley, with its layered silences and its sun-baked scars, refused to give up the last word. At dawn, the shadows cast by Spider Rock stretched long and thin, slashing across the hard-pan earth like warnings or invitations. Here, even the simplest discovery bore a weight of double meaning. In the end, those who came seeking fortune were left with only questions and the imprint of his own obsession. Dave's legend became the gold. Scholars, scavengers, and truth-seekers would make pilgrimages for years to come, pacing the arid ground in the hope of deciphering what he could not. But Spider Rock, patient and inscrutable, watched over its secrets, marking the passage of time not with fortunes, but with the hush of wind over stone and the shifting dust that would never settle. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only remembered.